I'm truly delighted to be here after a number of years. I was here maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it's so nice to be back. And I just... You want to remove this one? No, just go with this. Could we just go with this? All right. I love your singing. And I've been to churches where people can't sing. It's more like a graveyard. But to be here and listen to you sing, that kind of sets the tone for our service. And music and singing is as much a part of worship as is prayer, right? I think Ellen White says that. And so I'm delighted to be here. This, as has already been stated, is a special weekend, a special Sabbath for Mercy and her family. Tomorrow, Amy is getting married, and we're all excited. And so, in planning for this weekend, Mercy turned to her pastor and said, "Pastor, would it be possible, since it's going to be a special weekend for our family, would it be possible for somebody from the family to preach the sermon on this special Sabbath?" I am part of the family. I'm Mercy's brother-in-law, married to her older sister. And let me tell you, when you look at all these beautiful girls in the Daniel family, you'll wonder how I ever got in. They made me jump through hoops to qualify. I think they were looking for somebody tall, handsome, and with a full head of hair. 3 strikes against me. 3 strikes. But perseverance and hard work pays off. In November of this year, my wife and I will be married for 42 years. We have a daughter. She should be here. She came for the wedding. Maybe she's at another church. Our daughter had a baby recently, our first granddaughter. Our son also should be here somewhere, but maybe he'll show up before the service is over. So we have other members of the family here, and I'm so delighted to be here. You know, I live in Laurel, Maryland, and I checked my cell phone. That's the distance between Laurel, Maryland, and White Marsh. 33 minutes. Time to get here, 38 minutes. Cost in gas, $3 to $5. Would you believe it? Every time I come here to preach, I get stuck in traffic. And I wonder whether I'll ever make it. And the same thing happened today. I was sitting in the Baltimore tunnel, wondering whether I'll ever make it here. But I thank God that I made it here in time, because I'm so delighted. I would have missed that music and all the rest of it. I'm glad to be here. You know, it kind of reminds me of a story. And I preach in different churches, and I tell stories. I've been here before some years ago, and some of you with good memories. A gentleman saw me today, and he said, "I remember you." So you may remember some things that I've told, maybe some stories that I've told. And when you're late as often as I am, I have to have some stories, right? And I may recycle the stories. So this story, if you heard it before, that's fine. If even one person hasn't heard it before, maybe it'll be good. All right? It's a story that Tony Campolo tells. How many of you know Tony Campolo? How many of you have heard of Tony Campolo? Nobody in this church? Tony Campolo is one of the best known preachers in America, a Baptist preacher. And he was also chairman of the sociology department at Eastern College, a Christian college in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for many years. And Tony Campolo happens to be a good friend of Seventh-day Adventists. He has visited almost every Adventist college campus here in the United States and abroad too. Conducted weeks of prayers. He's been graduation speaker. And when I was at Columbia Union College, now Washington Adventist University, when I was a student at Columbia Union College many, many years ago, Tony came there as a baccalaureate speaker. And I remember a story he told once. He said, Tony says, "I travel a lot. I travel all over the country to preach. And so sometimes I get off the airport and rush to the church to preach." It was in those days before cell phones and all of that stuff. And Tony got caught in traffic. And so he ran to a payphone booth. Those days you'd have payphones, right? We don't find them anymore. Everybody goes, he went to a payphone, and he waited because there was one guy on the phone for the longest time. He says maybe he was talking to his girlfriend, trying to convince her to marry him and all that, whatever. When forever, finally when he got his turn, he called and said, "I'm Tony Campolo." I'm your guest speaker, but I'm caught in traffic. I know I'm going to be late. Please don't panic. He says, on the platform, leave the last chair empty for me. And I'll just come in. You go on with the rest of the service, uninterrupted. I'll come in and slip into the chair at the end, and everything will be fine. He put the phone down, got into his car, and he drove like mad as fast as he could through the city traffic. Let's say it was the city of, Los Angeles. And he was supposed to go to the First Baptist Church of Los Angeles to preach. He got to the parking lot of that church, huffing and puffing and sweating. He came to a sudden stop, jammed his brakes, got out of the car, slammed the door, ran to the side door that opened to the platform. There was an empty chair. And Tony, very quiet, very dignified, went and sat down. Just as the head elder was introducing all the people on the platform. One by one he introduced. And then he got to Tony and said, "And who are you?" he asked. "Who am I? I'm Tony." "Tony who?" "Tony Campolo. I'm the guy who called you from the payphone a while ago saying that I'm going to be late to leave a chair for me. I'm your guest speaker." Elder said, "No, you're not a guest speaker. We already have our preacher." Tony said, "That must be some mistake." He said, "Isn't this the First Baptist Church of Los Angeles?" The head elder said, "Other side of town." Tony, embarrassed, apologized and made a beeline for the door to get in his car and drive across the city. And as he was leaving, the head elder looked at him and said, "Sorry, mister. Right preacher, wrong church." Whenever I go to a church as a guest speaker, the first thing I do is pick up the bulletin. Right church? Right preacher? Confirmed. And even if it were wrong here, I see my sister-in-law Mercy here and the rest of the family, I know I'm in the right church. But whenever you worship with fellow brothers and sisters, you're always in the right place, aren't you? Wherever I go, in the United States, in India, any church, a church that I've never been to before, invariably I meet somebody that I know or somebody who knows somebody that I know. The Adventist family, Elder W.A. Spicer, former president of the General Conference, and after whom our Adventist college in India is named, from which I graduated, Spicer Memorial. Elder W.A. Spicer used to love to say that the Adventist family is the greatest family on the face of the earth. Aren't you glad to be part of that family? I'm glad to be here today, and thank you for the opportunity. And Pastor Diago was very kind to extend this invitation to me. He said, "I have only one request. Only one request. Could you present a message? Could you present a message?" So I knew right away that I would have to table the message that I was planning on and come up with something new. Could you present a message that would encourage our members to get involved in evangelism? He said evangelism is the lifeblood of the church. And if people are not involved in it, and I am so thrilled to hear all the wonderful stories that Pearl had to share with us. If you're not involved in evangelism, the church will eventually die. And so that was his request. And so I scratched my head and came up with this topic. And I pray that the Lord will bless my words. May not be my words, but his words through me. And it might bless each one of us in our Christian walk and help us to be better witnesses for him. The case against salt shaker Christianity. The case against salt shaker Christianity. Please pray with me before we begin. Father in heaven, thank you so much for this Sabbath day, for the privilege of gathering in your house of worship with brothers and sisters who have the same faith that we have, who look forward to the coming of Jesus, but also realize that before Jesus can come, there is a work to be done here. And help us that we might become the kind of people, witnesses for you, that will enhance your kingdom. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. If you have your Bibles, I would invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 12, and we'll look at verses 1 through 12. Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. With so many people here, you'll have different versions of the Bible. So I'm not going to ask you to read along with me, because that'll be like speaking in tongues, because each version is different. But would you please follow along with me as I read this portion of Scripture taken from the New Living Translation. All right? You've all found your place in the Bible? Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Just follow with me in your whatever version you have as I read it from the New Living Translation. One day, as the crowds were gathering, Jesus went up the mountainside with his disciples and sat down to teach them. This is what he taught them. God blesses those who realize their need for him, for the kingdom of heaven is given to them. God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. God blesses those who are gentle and lowly, for the whole world will belong to them. God blesses those who are hungry and thirsty for justice, for they will receive it in full. God blesses those who are merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. We're talking a lot about mercy today. God blesses those whose hearts are pure, for they will see God. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called the children of God. God blesses those who are persecuted because they live for God, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. God blesses you when you are mocked and persecuted and lied about because you are my followers. Be happy about it. Be glad, for a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets were persecuted too. Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 together comprise what is commonly known as what? Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. The Sermon on the Mount. These three chapters together make up what we call the Sermon on the Mount. But the first 12 verses of chapter 5, the one that we just read, are generally referred to as the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are believed to be the most frequently read portion of the Bible. Numerous books have been written about them. Countless sermons preached from this portion of Scripture. Even people who reject Christianity find themselves drawn to the message contained in these verses. Mahatma Gandhi, how many are familiar with Mahatma Gandhi? The founder of the Indian nation, my country. Mahatma Gandhi, who remained a devout Hindu all his life, often meditated on the Beatitudes and sought to order his life accordingly. But speaking to E. Stanley Jones was a famous Methodist minister from the United States who went as a missionary to India in the early 1900s. And he was a friend of Mahatma Gandhi. And Gandhi once said to E. Stanley Jones, this famous minister, "I love your Christ. I don't like your Christians. Your Christians are nothing like your Christ." Coming from a devout Hindu who loved Jesus, who loved the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, I love your Christ. I don't like your Christians. You Christians are nothing like your Christ. If Christians had only lived out the message of the Beatitudes, Gandhi might have become a Christian. Writing more than 100 years ago, Ellen White would write a similar idea. She would say, if Christians were more loving toward one another, there would be 100 conversions to Christ, but today there is only one. Over the years, I've had the privilege of preaching a number of sermons on each of these different Beatitudes. You know, there are about 8 Beatitudes. I preached in my church and different churches sermons, all of that. But today, my focus is going to be on one verse. The verse that comes immediately after the last beatitude. Matthew 5:13. And this is how it reads. You are the salt of the earth. But what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it useful again? No. It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. How many of you are familiar with Eugene Peterson? Eugene Peterson's version, the Message Bible. He uses some contemporary language for us to better understand it. This is how Eugene Peterson renders it. Let me tell you why you are here. That's what he's talking about. All of us Christians. Let me tell you why you are here. You are here to be salt seasoning that brings out God's flavors of this earth. Amen. That's the only reason you are. God has put you here to bring out the God's seasonings in this world. If you lose your saltiness, says Peterson, how will people taste godliness? You've lost your usefulness and will end up in the garbage. You are the salt of the earth. That's what Matthew 5:13 says. It's a simple verse, just a simple sentence. Nothing complex about it, but there's a whole lot of theology that is packed into that one sentence. You are the salt of the earth. And I would like us to focus on those 4 words there. You are salt earth. You got that? Number 1, you. Who's the you that Jesus was talking about there? Who's the you? When he preached this Sermon on the Mount, who was he referring to? Come on, let me hear it a lot. Christian, us, disciples of Jesus. He says, and seeing the multitude, the old King James Version saying, and seeing the multitude, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, this is disciples. So Jesus was addressing believers. But Ellen White says that even though the Sermon on the Mount was addressed primarily to the disciples, it was spoken in the presence of a large multitude. Perhaps there were many in the crowd, future, potential disciples of Jesus who were there. And Jesus wanted them to know what it takes to be a disciple of Jesus. Discipleship isn't easy, as Paul mentioned to us. It's hard. Witnessing isn't easy. And Jesus wanted his disciples and his potential disciples in the crowd, because Luke says there were a multitude of disciples besides just the 12 of them. He wanted them to know what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so when Jesus says in this verse, you are the salt of the earth, he is referring to you and to me. Amen. Those of us who profess to be Christians, to be followers of Jesus, who call ourselves Christians, who take that name. Jesus says, if you are a Christian, then this is for you. Okay? It's not for the people outside there. Because, some of the things that are mentioned over here does not apply to the population in general. Blessed are you when men shall persecute and revile you and see all manner of evil falsely for my sake. People are not going to persecute the people who are not Christians for Christ's sake. You see? So this is the passage that is referred to primarily to the disciples of Jesus. The second word there, are. You are the salt of the earth. What do you get from that word? You are. Hamlet, Shakespeare's famous play called Hamlet, has a line in it that is so often quoted. To be or not to be, that is the question. To be or not to be. But when it comes to this, it's not optional. You have no choice to be or not to be. Jesus says you are. You are the salt of the earth. If you're a Christian, you're salt. If you're not salt, what? You're not a Christian. There's no such thing as saltless Christianity. You get that? So that's what Jesus is saying. You disciples, you who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, you are the ones I'm talking to. You are the salt of the earth. You are. He's not saying, I want you to be salt. I want you to try and become salt. No, the moment you sign up as a disciple of Jesus, you're expected to be salt. Get that? Then the third word there is salt. But since salt is something that we're going to talk about mostly in this sermon, I'll deal with that last. Let's look at the one earth. You are the salt of the earth. You can use the word salt and earth interchangeably. What did Jesus mean when he said to his disciples, you are the salt of the earth? Did he have to emphasize that? Do we have to emphasize that in some of our churches or most of our churches? I think we have to. Because a lot of Christians believe that we are the salt of the church. We're here within these four walls, as it were. This is where our ministry is. And a lot of people go to church several hours on a Sunday or on a Saturday, and that's the extent of their religious experience. Everything happens within the walls of a church. And the world does not come into the equation. Jesus says, no, you are the salt of the earth. Donald Messer was a well-known seminary president and author of many books. And in one of my seminary classes, I read one of his books. And Donald Messer says, years ago, when he first started off in the ministry, he pastored a little church, a little rural church in Kimball, South Dakota. The church had only 50 members. But on the day that he was ordained, this little church of 50 members had a party to celebrate the ordination of their pastor. And they baked a cake. And they asked the pastor, what is your favorite text? We want to put it on the Bible. We want to put it on the cake. And what text do you think the pastor chose? For the most famous text in the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That is my favorite text, he said. And so these people in that little church baked a cake and wanted to put their pastor's favorite text on the cake, but it wouldn't fit on that. So what they did, they just put the first line. For God so loved the world. And Messer says, these were simple rural people with no great theological training. And they didn't know, they didn't realize that in what they did, they had defined for me early in my ministry what ministry is all about. God's great love. God's first great love is not the church, it's the world. Amen. God uses the church to reach the world. And let us never forget that. The children of Israel were called by God, chosen people, and they somehow felt that they were special. That the light that God gave them, the 10 Commandments and the Torah and all the special light that they received, they said it was for themselves because they were special people. They kept it for themselves and didn't let their light shine. But Jesus says here, you are the light, you're the salt of the world. You know, Christ has given to this church, to the church, a double identity. We as a church have a double identity. We are called out of the world to come and worship Jesus. Then we are sent back into the world to serve and to witness. You get that double identity? We are a called out people, but we are also a sent out people. God calls us in. He trains us as he called his disciples. He trained them, and then he says, go. Our scripture reading was Matthew 28, 19 and 20. We all know that as the Gospel Commission. And how does it read? Go ye therefore and make disciples of all people. That's your job. God calls you. We are a called out people. But we must not stop there. We are also a sent out people. Worshiping and witnessing always go together. Worshiping and witnessing always go together. Some of the best, one of the largest and most prominent churches in America are known for their worship services. You go in there, the organ and the sanctuary and the stained glass windows and the plush carpeting and the beautiful furniture, everything is so beautiful. The worship atmosphere is out of this world. And when you're in the church, you're transported out of this world into heaven, as it were. Worship becomes so important to them. But the second part is so often forgotten. Worship and witnessing always go together. True worship prepares us. True worship prepares us to be better witnesses. You get that? Worship that does not make us better witnesses is empty religion. Strong words. Worship that does not make us better witnesses is empty religion. Elton Trueblood was a famous preacher in the mid-1900s, and he's written a lot. Let me share a few words that he's talked about worship and mission. Worship is important, he says, but it tends to be overemphasized in the contemporary church. He says worship tends to be overemphasized. We advertise this group is coming to sing, this is happening, all of this is happening in our church building. We emphasize the worship. We say it's important, but it tends to be overemphasized. Its main responsibility is always outside its walls. The church's main responsibility is not in here. Yes, we nurture and sustain our members, encourage them, but our main responsibility of the church is always outside our walls. And I know your pastor would be thrilled to know that I use some of these words to encourage you, that we need to be out there. Yes, we need to worship, but true worship will always make us better witnesses for Christ. He goes on, no person is really a Christian. Get this, no person is really a Christian unless he is an evangelist or getting ready to be an evangelist. How do you like that? You're not a Christian if you're not an evangelist already or getting ready to be one. A church, he says, a church, however large its buildings, or however grand its ceremonies of vestments, is a denial of Christ if it is not affecting the world. You can have the best show in town, like a circus here. It might be a beautiful church, a large church, the music great, everything. But if it's not affecting the world out there, what's happening in here is a denial of Christ. Strong words. So that's what Elton Trueblood says here. And then he says, the church is never true to itself when it is living for itself. For it is chiefly concerned with the saving of its own life, and it will lose it. If the church is concerned about saving its own life, concerned about its inner life, and not about people out there, it's going to lose its life. And so we look at the four words there. You. Who's the you? All of us who claim to be followers of Jesus. Are. What does that mean? Does it give you an option? To be or not to be, is that an option? No. If you're a disciple, you are a Christian. If you're not a Christian, if you're not a witness, then you're not a disciple of Jesus. And then we talked about earth. The whole world is God's parish. For a lot of people, a lot of Christians, the parish becomes our world. God says no. The world out there is our parish. Those are the people we need to reach. And then the fourth word there, salt. I put it in white because salt is usually white, right? Salt. You know that salt is taken for granted in today's society? Do you take salt for granted? Sometimes I don't take it for granted because my wife is busy cooking for a big feast and we're having all that, and then we run out of salt. But I can't do without that. So I got to jump in the car and go to a grocery place and buy the salt. But generally, salt is underappreciated. If you don't believe it, just go to the supermarket. Just go to the supermarket and pick up a bottle or a carton of salt. Look at the price. There was a time you could buy the daily newspaper or a piece of chewing gum for 25 cents. My first job in America was at a 7-Eleven, and I would stand there when there were no customers. I would stand before the candy rack. You know, in India we had one brand of candy when I was growing up. One brand called 5-Star. And I came here, got my first job in a 7-Eleven. I stood there at the candy rack, look, I was, oh my, so many. And you can buy some for 25 cents. Today, I can't think of anything you can get for 25 cents. The daily newspaper's $2 something, right? A piece of gum is some. I went to 7-Eleven, they got a donut. Donuts are $1 something, a single donut. So they're expensive. But you know what? You can still get salt for under $1. We don't have much value for salt. But that is not how it was in Jesus' day. The Greeks used a word called theon for salt. Salt comes from the word theos, which also comes from the same word as divine. For them, they thought salt has a divine origin. It comes from the same root word as theos, from which we get our word theology, or the study of God. The Romans believed that apart from the sun, the most precious commodity on earth was salt. Roman soldiers were paid their salary in salt. That is why you say he's worth his salt. Our English word for salary means salt money. So when Jesus referred to his disciples as salt of the earth, they immediately knew what he meant. He meant that they were most precious to him. But they also knew one more thing. Not only were they most precious to Jesus, they also knew that they had some special functions to perform, just as salt had certain functions. And quickly, let's look at some of the functions of salt. Salt is a cleansing agent. Do we need cleansing? Yes. Do we need cleansing in our lives? Does the word need cleansing? Does the church need cleansing? Yes. And God uses us to do that. But if the salt has lost its savor, if we have polluted ourselves, we cannot be a cleansing agent for Christ. You see that? So salt is a cleansing agent. Can you think of another function of salt? I mentioned that about food. Most foods are tasteless. Apply some salt, the flavor comes out. God says, I want you as my believers to be in the world that has lost its taste, its flavor, its joy of living. There are people who have everything in life, but they have lost all meaning in life. You look at the suicide rates we have in the world. People have money, they have fame and all of that, but life has lost its meaning, its taste. And God says, as salt of the earth, you must be my representatives to bring that meaning back into people's lives. Third one, salt creates thirst. Salt creates thirst. God says, I put you as salt in the world so that when you mix with people, when they see the way you live your life, they will become thirsty for the living water. Like the woman at the well, they say, give me that, what you have, give me that to drink so I may not thirst again. So that's an important function of salt. Salt is a preservative. And I think Peter, as he sat in the front row and listened to Jesus tell this, he must have said to us, I know that. When I buy fish, when I have a big catch overnight, I have no refrigerator, I have no deep freezer, I have nothing. The fish will go bad, and so he brings it on shore and he dumps a whole lot of salt on it to preserve it. Does the world need preservation? Yes. Are there values that are going out the window? Are there things that we want to hold on, Christian values that we want to hold on to? Christians ought to be the first to lead the way in preserving values. And as salt of the earth, that is what we ought to be doing. And finally, salt is a healing agent. I ask you the question, does the world need healing? Yes. Does the church need healing? Yes. Do our families need healing? Amen. need healing. Joseph Parker was a famous British preacher who many years ago said, there is a broken heart in every pew. There is a broken heart in every, not out there in the world. He's talking about the church. He says there's a broken heart in every pew. Speak to them, and you will never lack for a congregation. He says even among the children of God, when you come to church, there are burdens that we carry. There are heartaches that we have. There are disappointments that we have. There's a broken heart in every pew that calls for healing. And as Christians, as believers, as salt of the earth, we are to be healing agents. A story is told of a man named Charles Bowen. During World War II, a ship by the name of Athenia was torpedoed by the Germans, and hundreds of people were thrown into the water, many of them badly wounded. And when a rescue ship came and rescued all of these people, they soon ran out of medicine, and they didn't know where the next help would come from. People were dying. Charles Bowen, who happened to be on that ship, said, draw water from the ocean into the little swimming pools that you have. You know, sometimes you have these tubs and all on the boat. And he had all these wounded people dip in the salt water several times a day. And the story says not one person died. They all survived till rescue came by way of another ship. Salt can be a healing agent. So when Jesus said to his disciples, you are the salt of the earth, that's what he had in mind. That's what he had in mind. He wants you to do that. Healing agents cause thirst in people for the living water and all the other things that we talked about. But you know, I am a chemist by training. All right? Yes, theology also, but I'm a chemist by training. And we chemists are interested in the functions of substances, as we saw here right now. What functions of them? But we're also interested in the functioning of substances. Not only what does salt do, but how does salt do it? How does salt do it? I'm not going to bore you with all these complicated chemical reactions here today. I'm going to give it to you in simple language. How does salt do its job? What is number one step? Come on, someone, tell me, what is the number one step for salt to do its work? Rather obvious. It's in the title of my message for today. The case against salt shaker Christianity. The number one thing is what? Leave the salt shaker. If you sit in the salt shaker from now till hell freezes over, you're not going to do anybody any good. Salt in the salt shaker is absolutely useless. Rebecca Pippert Manley wrote a book many years ago, Out of the Salt Shaker. Out of the salt shaker. And God says, I want you to get out of the salt shaker. And for many of us, our church is our salt shaker. And when you look at this church is kind of shaped like a salt shaker, isn't it? Right? Get out of the salt shaker. Get out into the world. That's what God wants you to do. And unless you leave the security home, you cannot be of any use to anybody. Someone has said, a ship is safe in the harbor. But that's not what ships were made for. The safest place for a ship is in the harbor. No storms, none of these problems. But that's not what ships were made for. And Christians can be safe inside a church. Most places. But that's not what that's what a church is made for. I can't read that. That's so far away. Let me read it. Yeah. There was a guy by the name of C.D. Studd. He was a famous British cricket player. He came from a wealthy family. And when he became a Christian, he was somehow led by the Spirit to give up everything and go out as a missionary. He went as a missionary to India, to China, and to Africa. Spent his entire life and all his savings. And this is what C.D. Studd says. Some want to live within sound of church or chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell. He says some people want to stay close to a church where they can hear the chapel bells, where they can feel safe in a familiar surrounding. But I want to go out there to the ends of the world, within a yard of hell. And that's what he did. You cannot make a difference. You cannot make a difference in people's lives if you do not leave the salt shaker. You see, salt in our house, stove is here, there's a cupboard up here, that's where the salt is. That's where the salt is. So reach out, bring the salt, sprinkle it on the food. You know, I think I noticed something. Very brilliant of me to notice this. I didn't think I was that brilliant. We never take the food to the salt, we bring the salt to the food. Isn't that a brilliant observation? The salt must come to the food. The food doesn't go. The salt, we must go to the world. The world won't come to us. Andrew Fearing was Associate Ministerial Director of the General Conference years ago when I was in high school. And I remember he visited India as part of an itinerary that covered the Southern Asia Division. And after it's all over, he was conducting a last workshop for ministers and conference people. And word went out that he was a very, very interesting guy. And so the Sabbath afternoon session was open to everybody, not just to pastors. And I was a little fool. I said, I'm going too. So I went there. And I sat and listened. This is 45 years, maybe 50 years ago. And one of the stories he told that has stayed with me after all of these years. And Andrew tells this story. And Andrew Fearing says, as my name indicates, he says, I'm a very fearful person. Andrew Fearing. I'm timid. He said, when I got into the ministry, I thought the ministry would be so easy. I can stand behind the pulpit from Sabbath to Sabbath and preach wonderful sermons and then go home. And my senior pastor says, no, Andrew, that's not what it's all about. You have to go door to door visiting people. Andrew said, oh no. So the senior pastor took him for several weeks. And then one week he said, next Sabbath, you're on your own. Andrew said, oh my God, please, take this cup away from me. I can't do it. And he said, God, as my name indicates, I'm fearful. I'm Andrew Fearing. I can't do it. But then God says, if you want to be a minister, you got to do it. It's not optional. If you want to be salt, you have to witness for me. So that Sabbath afternoon, for the first time, he went out by himself. He knocked on a door and a few people smiled. Maybe the third or fourth door, a gruff old man opened the door and said, what do you want? Andrew says, I am a Seventh-day Adventist preacher. I've come here to share some of the best news in the world with you. And the man slammed the door. Andrew knocked again. The man opened the door. And the man says, didn't you get my message? Out of here, I don't want to see you again. The next Sabbath, Andrew was back. Knocked on the door. Again the man says, didn't you get my message last week? I don't want you here. Slammed the door. The third week, timid, fearful Andrew Fearing was there again. The man opened the door a little bit. And Andrew says, before he knew what was happening, a hand stuck out and a soda bottle crashed on his head. And he said he collapsed to the ground like a wet rag, and he bled quite a bit. And he said he had to get numerous stitches. And he says for years, Andrew was now an old man, almost close to retirement. But he says for years the scars remained on my forehead. I almost died. Andrew was in the hospital, and he had time to get over this. And when he felt well enough, on a Sabbath afternoon, he goes and knocks on that same door. The man opened the door and says, you again? Do you want me to call the police? And Andrew, this time fearful Andrew, says, go ahead. What are you going to tell the police? That a nice, harmless young man who wanted to share the best news in the world with you came and you broke a soda bottle on his head and almost killed him? Is that what you're going to tell the police? The man finally said, okay, just 5 minutes. Allowed him into the house. Andrew went in and looked at the living room, all kinds of artwork and carvings and all of that. Andrew says, where did all that come from? And the man says, I'm an artist. I make all of these things. I can show you. He took him downstairs to his workshop and showed him all of that stuff, and they spent a good hour or two there. And finally the man said, hey, you were going to share some good news with me. Andrew says, it's kind of getting late. If it's okay with you, I'll come back next Saturday. And Andrew said, one of the tips in witnessing, don't give them the whole bit in one sermon. Keep them wanting more. And the man said, okay. When Andrew said, I went back, Sabbath after Sabbath after Sabbath. This man was eventually baptized. And Andrew, with tears in his face, says, this man, every time there's a testimony service in his church, this man would stand up as the head elder of his church and say, if it weren't for Andrew Fearing, that young man who set his fears aside and came to my door, I wouldn't be a believer today. Let me go fast here. Second one. Not only should we leave the salt shaker, we must make contact. You can get out of that church and get in a car and go around the block a few times. That doesn't do it. You have to make contact. Whom you do not touch, you cannot change. Whom you do not touch, you cannot change. I had a few more things, but I'm going fast. Then there's the next part. Salt must penetrate the food. Maybe that's from McDonald's French fries, salt all on the... Salt must penetrate the food. It's so easy for us as Christians to go and visit with people for a few minutes. When I was in college, we would leave the Adventist college campus, go out in the community, have a brand Sabbath school, and in a few hours we'd go back to the safety of this thing and we'd say, oh, we did our job. There was no commitment to what was happening there. And the people knew we were not concerned about them. We were just doing it. There are two kinds of ministry. Two kinds of ministry. One is called informational ministry. Informational ministry. We tend to feel that we have accomplished the gospel commission when we give people information. We give them a tract. We preach a sermon over the radio or the television or internet. Whatever we do all of these things. But so informational ministry costs time and money, but it does not cost us our lives. There is another kind of ministry, incarnational ministry. The definition of incarnation is to embody in the flesh, and this requires living among those to whom we are sent. All authentic ministry is incarnational. Even Jesus himself came to a place when he says, for thousands of years I've been sending my prophets, I've sent my word, the Bible, to people. I've given them all kinds of information, but that's not enough. I have to go down in person and live among them. Incarnational ministry, and that's what Jesus did. And if that's what Jesus did, can we expect any less from any of us? Then the salt, come out of the salt shaker, make contact, penetrate, spread. Some people will go to only my kind of people, right? I go to my kind of people. People are comfortable with this. No, salt does not discriminate. When you put salt, salt goes to every nook and cranny of the food. It goes everywhere, not discriminating at all. The same way, we ought to go to everybody. We can't stay in one place. In India, we used to use a salt called rock salt. I don't know whether they use it here. When I came, I saw the salt so fine. I said, oh my, very fine salt. We had crystals like rock. And sometimes when you cook your food and the salt doesn't dissolve completely, you may bite into a piece of salt in it. Awful feeling when you have that. Salt has to spread throughout the food. Can you see that? Is it clear enough? Horse dung for sale. Talking about horse dung in church? Horse dung for sale. The reason I put that is, someone once said, Christians are like manure. Let that sink in. Christians are like manure. Pile them all up in one place, and they stink to high heavens. Spread them out, and they become fertilizer that brings life and nourishment to the soil. Christians are like manure. Pile them all up in one place, and they stink to high heavens. Spread them out, and they become fertilizer that brings life and nourishment to the soil. And the same is true of salt. Put all the salt in one place, spread it out, and it brings out the flavor of food. Salt must, what else? It must dissolve. What if the salt says, no, I want to remain as a crystal. I don't want to dissolve. I want to retain my identity. It's important for who I am, for people to know who I am. When I dissolve, I become part of everything and nobody knows anything about me. But a lot of people in ministry, for them, ministry is about them. Did people see me? Did they make the right poster about me? It was my picture. Do I look good in the picture? Everything is about them. It's not about you. The ministry is about the people you're going to serve. And so the salt has to dissolve. Finally, I have so many things to say, but I have to go fast. I know. So this is the final point. Salt must what? Disappear. Or what? Another word for that is what? Salt must die. A dying to self. You see how much salt is there? The salt is refusing to disappear. That salt does no good to the food. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, maybe you heard his name. Famous Lutheran pastor during World War II in Germany. When Hitler was killing millions of Jews in the gas chambers of Germany, people kept their mouths shut. Nobody opposed Hitler. Sadly, the vast majority of Seventh-day Adventists went along with Hitler. It was one of the dark chapters in the history of our church. Few people, among them Dietrich Bonhoeffer, spoke out, a Lutheran pastor, and he paid for it with his life. Just weeks before the Allied soldiers rescued or delivered the people from Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged in his prison cell. But he was a man who spoke out. And he disappeared as a result. Let me, as I give you my final story, go over these points about how salt does its work. It's important for us to remember. Salt must what? Leave. Let's go back. Salt must leave the salt shaker. That's important. Without leaving, there's nothing that'll be done. Salt must make contact. Salt must penetrate the food. Our concern about people has to be beyond superficial. We must feel their hurts. We must be a part of their life. Salt must spread. Not just the people we're comfortable with, people from our own race, our own culture, our own educational background, or whatever it is. We must cross all these barriers, just as salt crosses all barriers. Salt must dissolve. It's not about us. It's not about us. Our identity is not important. John the Baptist said, I must decrease, but he must increase. That's how it should be. And finally, salt must disappear or die. Her name is Ruby. Beautiful name. I thought of Ruby, a precious stone, and I met Pearl today, another precious stone here today. Ruby was an older lady, approaching retirement. It was the year 1964. I was a high school student in India, and our Adventist college, Spicer Memorial College, had a high school, a college, and an elementary school on the same campus. And we attended the same church and all of that. It was summer holidays, and I was back home, northern part of India, where my dad worked as business administrator of one of our Adventist hospitals, and my mother was a nurse there. And so I left Spicer Memorial College in the south central part of India, traveled north of almost 1,000 miles to the city of Ranchi, where my parents lived. And in that hospital where my dad was the business administrator, Dr. Philip Nelson, an American doctor, was the medical director. And his wife, Ruby, was one of the nurses. But Ruby soon gave up her nursing career to do something different. She noticed that when patients were discharged from the hospital after major surgery, they had no way to get home. And in the hot and walking in the sand, barefoot, going home, no way. So she used her little black Fiat car, taking people back and forth. All day long, she would take patients home, bring patients to the hospital, and she did that year after year after year. And that summer of that year that I came home for my holidays, it was 1 week for the holidays to be over. I was to go back to boarding school, and so we were doing last-minute shopping. And this hospital was set in the suburban area, out away from the middle of the city. To get there, you had to take a bus, and buses were hard to come by, all of that stuff. So Ruby said to my mother, I'll take you all shopping. I have a light day today. So she said, jump into my Fiat car. So we jumped into Ruby's Fiat car, and she drove us downtown to do our shopping. And then we came to an intersection. It was those days before traffic lights in India. No traffic lights there. We had a drum upside down drum on which a police officer stood, and he would have a whistle, he would blow on direct traffic. And as we approached that intersection, Ruby turned to us at the back and said, that police officer, I think he likes me. He's my boyfriend. And she says, the minute I come here, he's going to stop the other traffic and let me go through. Sure enough, as she pulled up, he saw her. He twirled his mustache, blew his whistle, stopped the traffic, and let Ruby go. And we did our shopping. A week later, I was back in school, boarding school. Ruby and her husband were returning to America. On permanent return, they were retiring. They packed all their belongings in that little Fiat car that over the years had run so many errands of mercy. And they drove from this city to New Delhi, the capital of India. And there they were to sell the car to somebody who wanted to buy it for virtually nothing, and then fly off to the United States. In India, even today, the roads are not that good. They're a lot better now than they were. But back then, roads were so bad. Sometimes you can have a car going down the road, and it'll be an hour or two before the next car comes. And so we have bandits and all the other people who put roadblocks and attack people and all of that. So it's not safe at all. Ruby and her husband driving. Late afternoon, we had a flat tire. Didn't know what to do. So finally, Philip turned to his wife Ruby and said, I'll see if I can hitch a ride in a truck that comes by. I'll go to the nearest city. I'll buy a new tire, maybe get a mechanic to help us. You stay in the car and don't open the windows or doors. Philip was gone. Longer than she had thought. And finally, when it got dark, Philip came back looking for Ruby, calling her name. No sign of her. No sign of Ruby anywhere. While all this was happening, I was back in boarding school. You get the picture? The week before, I was in her car going shopping. I was back in boarding school having a peaceful sleep that night, and Philip was looking for Ruby. Next day when we met for classes, college, high school, all of the classes, there was an announcement made over the public address system. All classes to be suspended. All students meet in the college auditorium for a special chapel service. And I was one of them. High school students usually sat in the front, so I sat in the front there. And our college president, with a long face, a sober face, read a message. He said, I just received this message from our division president. The city of Pune, Adventist College this side, the city in the middle, 7 miles away on the other side is the division headquarters. The division president sent a message to the college president and said, share this message with the faculty and staff. The message simply said, Dr. Philip Nelson sent this message to Dr. Lowry, who was our division president. He says, found Ruby in a pool of blood. Broken-hearted Phil. I don't know what the story is. We will never know the true nature of the story because Ruby never lived to tell her side of the story. There are many versions of the story. When I heard that a few weeks later, police with dogs traced some men down to a village a few miles away. They were sitting around a circle playing cards, and the dog picked them, pulled them one by one. These men were tried and hanged. But in the trial, they were asked. And they said, when Philip Nelson left to get the car tire, he was talking to his wife, and we saw his wife take money out and hand it over to him. And after he left, we came and demanded the money. She refused. She refused. And we threatened, she still refused. Then she took out her kitchen knife and she tried to protect herself. And finally, when they realized that they meant business, she rolled down the window enough and gave them the money. It was now dark. And as they were leaving, this is according to the men, she clicked the camera a few times. They turned around. We're on film. We'll get caught. They broke the car, ransacked it, completely smashed it, threw everything around, dragged Ruby down the grassy slopes 100 or so yards away, and there they stabbed her. I hear one version that they cut off her tongue so that she couldn't tell, and then someone said, oh, she can write, and so they decapitated her. I sat there in that front row just a week before I sat in her car. I heard a joke, that's my boyfriend. A bubbly woman who gave her entire life helping the poor people, running errands of mercy. She, as the doctor's wife, could have lived a wonderful, comfortable life here in America. But she chose to leave the salt shaker. And went off to far off India and worked among the poor and disadvantaged people of my country. See, when David Livingstone, the great British missionary, doctor, and explorer, went to Africa, and he died there, the people loved him so much that they wanted to bury him in Africa. But the British government says, no, we want to give him a royal funeral and bury him in Westminster Abbey along with the kings and princes and the famous people of the world. So the African people said, okay. They carved out his heart, buried it in Africa, said his heart belongs to Africa, you can take his body. And David Livingstone was buried among the famous of the world. No such thing happened for Ruby. Her body lies buried in the soil of India, the country she loved and sacrificed so much for. A simple grave. But today, if you were to go to the northern city of Jalandhar in northern part of India, there is a hospital named the Ruby Nelson Memorial Hospital. Her work continues. She was Salt who left the salt shaker. She was Salt who made contact with people. Her contact wasn't just superficial. She penetrated their lives. And it wasn't just the rich people. She spread like salt all over the food. She dissolved. She forgot herself. She forgot her career as a nurse. She said, no, that's not important. I'm going to do this lowly job, transporting people back and forth. And finally, she disappeared. She died. But the salt can only do its job when salt is willing to die and disappear. You are the salt of the earth. You, all of you, in me, are. There's no choice there. We are or we are not. We can be comfortable in our churches, but our parish is out there in the world. God has called us to be salt. I pray that He would give us the courage that He gave to so many people, missionaries and people all over through the years, and people like Ruby, who left the comfort of the salt shaker, went out of the world to make a difference. Be, by God's grace, the salt of the earth. Amen.